Well, I first heard about backward messages in rock and roll back in the early 80s, and when I first heard about it, I was rather incredulous, like most people are, and I went home that night. When I went home and I rewired a tape player to run some of these records backwards, fully expecting to hear nothing but overactive imagination, and I was hearing these clear phrases amongst the music, and it got me intrigued. I'm an electronics buff. I've been a ham radio operator for many years, so I've got a very good ear for sound, particularly faint sound, and these messages had an air of genuinity about them. I checked for intentional manipulation of the soundtracks, and the soundtracks hadn't been manipulated, and well, except for some cases. There were a few rare cases where rock groups use a technique called backward masking, where they actually superimpose a track backwards onto the record. That's fairly easy to tell when that's done, but by far the vast majority of messages were not intentionally placed there, and were occurring simply by the way the song was sung at the time. And I got some friends over, asked them if they could hear the same phrases, and everyone could, and I was intrigued, fascinated. Point of fact, there was the fundamentalist Christians were preaching on the circuit that this was the work of the devil, and I must admit there was a few days in my early weeks where I got a bit scared coming to my house at night, wondering if I was playing with some forces I didn't understand. But the satanic explanation went fairly quickly when I began to find a whole lot of other messages in records that were not occultically based, but right across the wide cross-section of topics. And then I accidentally stumbled across it in Human Speech a few months later, and it's changed the whole equation for me. It's one thing to find them in music, it's sort of like a bit of a gimmick, but to suddenly hear it in speech is another phenomenon altogether. And I began taping my friends and running them backwards, and I began to find these phrases constantly throughout speech. Sometimes as often as once every 15 or 20 seconds of a normal conversation. I went down to the libraries. I researched many topics, linguistics, to see if there's any other research on this being done, and I couldn't find any research anywhere. And even to this day, 20 years later, as far as I'm aware, I'm the only person in the world pursuing this, well, except for the students who I've subsequently trained, of course. I wrote to universities, linguistics and psychology departments, trying to get someone interested in looking at this, and either they didn't respond to me or they sent me a letter back telling me there's nothing to this, and put my endeavours elsewhere. And but I was convinced that I was onto something. I didn't know what it was at that stage, but I was convinced there was something to this. And then I eventually wrote my theory in 1987, April of 87, that language was bi-level, forwards and backwards, and I published it in a book called Beyond Backward Masking, which was sold 5,000 copies in Australia in the first year, which is quite an amazing success for Australia. And then that got me on the lecture circuit. Then I went to America, and one thing led to another, and here I am 20 years later still pursuing the same field.
Well, I'd like to pick up on the point, does this work whether the text, or whether one's reading from a prepared text, or whether we're speaking spontaneously?
It's occurring far less if you're reading from a prepared text. They're occurring most often in spontaneous, natural, everyday conversations. In the best place to find them is, quite frankly, when you've got a group of friends in a living room and you don't know the tape recorder's running, and you're just chatting about things that you talk about. Then you'll find them fairly frequently, like I say, often as once every 15 or 20 seconds. If someone's reading a prepared text, they drop dramatically. You might only find short phrases once every couple of minutes. Then you go to the other extreme, a politician giving a speech, like President Bush, for example. If he's giving a speech, I may find them only one intelligent phrase once every 4 or 5 minutes. Once he starts the press conference, once he starts the questions following his prepared text, then you'll start to find the reversal. So it's got something to do with the natural spontaneity of speech. I've theorised that it's coming from the right brain hemisphere because of this, but that's just a theory. I don't know that for sure, but certainly the best place to find them is in natural, spontaneous conversation.
Sorry, we have got a red light there.
Yes.
Just sorry, I was missing you for a second. Yeah. Just to pick up on that then, this fits in with some of the work that you did quite early on.
Yes.
Have you looked at that?
Oh yeah, I have. Well, actually, many people have compared what I'm doing to what Carl Jung did during his career. The comparison's been made many times. Certainly, reverse speech is very metaphorical in nature. There's a high proportion of metaphorical, archetypal language. And the metaphors I'm finding are very similar to the work that Jung to the work that Jung did in his lifetime. Certainly Jung explored the unconscious. I believe reverse speech is coming from the unconscious. When I'm working with my clients in therapy sessions, the way I monitor changes in my client's condition is by monitoring how the metaphors, as they're appearing in reverse speech, change. And Jung did a very similar thing with dream states. He would monitor the changing pictures, images in his client's dreams. So yeah, there is a strong comparison, I think, with the work that Jung's doing. I've read some of Jung's books. I must admit I find them a little bit laborious to get through, but I certainly feel an empathy with his work and what I'm doing.
You're probably aware that there are certain sceptical approaches to your work, in particular a study by Mark Newbrook and Jane Curtin from the Skeptics.
Yep, very familiar with.
Oh, good.
With that. Yes.
Well, I'd just like to read you one passage from what they said, and it was, obviously our findings do not support Oates' claim.
Right.
There is no evidence that listeners can hear the alleged reverse speech sequences unless prompted in advance.
Right. Well, for a start, let's just get this in perspective. Jane Curtin and Mark Newbrook have not run a tape recording of human speech backwards. That's one thing they have consistently refused to do. The tests that they conducted, they played 10 soundtracks to 30 independent subjects. In those 10 soundtracks, some of the subjects they asked if they could hear the reverse phrase. Other subjects they asked them to hear a phrase that was not there, and other subjects they asked if they could hear the phrase. The subjects who were prompted to hear what was there could hear them. They had about an 80% success rate. The subjects who were not prompted had a far lower success rate, and the subjects who were asked to hear a control phrase, the phrase was not there, could not hear it. So see, it depends on how you analyse that study. See, I would say if the phrase is not there, then you're not going to hear it anyway. If the phrase is there, then yes, you will hear it. Reverse speech takes some training. It has a fairly unique sound to it.